I'll check the uploaded framework first to ensure I'm following your complete system. Breaking news out of Washington and Ottawa, and what just unfolded in the past 72 hours represents one of the most stunning diplomatic humiliations in modern American trade history. President Trump has formally requested $1.5 trillion worth of critical infrastructure materials from Canada, only to receive what trade experts are calling the most savage counteroffer ever published in modern diplomatic relations. We're not talking about standard negotiation tactics. We're talking about a detailed 18-page response that itemizes every broken promise, every tariff violation, and every instance of bad faith dealing over the past 8 years, now circulating among G7 leaders and being shared millions of times across social media. Within 48 hours of Canada's response going public, American construction firms have seen contract financing dry up, steel futures have spiked 47%, and over 200,000 infrastructure workers are facing project cancellations that were supposed to break ground this spring. In the next 18 minutes, I'm going to break down exactly how Trump's infrastructure ambitions collided with the diplomatic wreckage of his own trade policies, who's paying the real price as shovel-ready projects evaporate, and why international trade analysts warn this could mark a permanent shift in how America's allies respond to requests for cooperation. The question everyone's asking is, how did we go from America first to America begging for materials we desperately need to rebuild our own crumbling roads and bridges? Let me paint you the picture of what just happened, and I want you to understand the timeline because it matters. On March 22, 2025, the White House Office of Infrastructure Coordination sent a formal request to the Canadian Ministry of Trade seeking priority access to 17 specific categories of construction materials. The request listed steel girders, concrete aggregates, electrical components, aluminum sheeting, and specialty materials required for the administration's promised $2 trillion infrastructure overhaul. According to documents obtained by Reuters, the request specifically asked for preferential pricing, expedited shipping schedules, and deferred payment terms extending up to 36 months. But this didn't happen in a vacuum. This is the culmination of a trade relationship that's been systematically dismantled over 8 years of escalating tariffs, broken agreements, and what Canadian officials privately call diplomatic arson. To understand how we got here, you need to know that US-Canada trade in construction materials represented $83 billion annually as recently as 2018. American infrastructure projects depended on Canadian steel for 38% of large-scale bridge construction, Canadian aluminum for 42% of electrical grid modernization, and Canadian aggregates for major highway projects across 17 states. The relationship wasn't just economic, it was integrated at every level of North American construction supply chains. By January 2025, that relationship had deteriorated to the point where Canadian exports of critical infrastructure materials to the United States had fallen by 62%. According to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, this wasn't market forces at work. This was the direct result of cascading tariffs, retaliatory measures, and what trade lawyers call the complete erosion of good faith dealing. Trump had imposed steel tariffs in 2018, aluminum tariffs in 2019, then expanded them in 2022, and doubled down again in 2024, each time justifying them as national security measures, even as American construction costs soared. Then came the breaking point. On February 8, 2025, the administration announced a sweeping infrastructure initiative promising to rebuild America's roads, bridges, and electrical grid. The plan required materials and supply chain cooperation that simply no longer existed. Within weeks, project planners from Texas to Michigan were reporting they couldn't source the steel quantities needed. Major construction firms told Congress they were facing 18 to 24-month delays on projects that were supposed to start immediately. The math was brutal. American steel production capacity sits at roughly 87 million tons annually. The infrastructure plan required an additional 45 million tons over 3 years. That gap couldn't be filled domestically, and after 8 years of trade warfare, traditional suppliers were no longer interested in helping. On March 22nd, facing project cancellations and political disaster, Trump's team sent the request to Canada. The response arrived March 24th, and it wasn't what anyone expected. Canada's counteroffer, officially titled Response to United States Request for Infrastructure Material Priority Access, ran 18 pages. And it gets worse. The document methodically listed every tariff imposed since 2017, every trade agreement violated, every diplomatic commitment broken, and then attached a price tag to cooperation that trade experts describe as deliberately impossible to accept. The terms included immediate removal of all existing tariffs on Canadian goods, payment of $12.3 billion in back tariffs that Canadian industries absorbed, guaranteed long-term contracts at market rates with no preferential pricing, and here's the kicker, a formal written apology from President Trump for what the document calls 8 years of economic hostility toward America's closest trading partner and military ally. The document included footnotes, citations to Trump's own statements calling Canadian trade practices a threat to national security, and a detailed breakdown of every American infrastructure project currently delayed specifically because of material shortages created by U.S. trade policy. Within hours, the document leaked. By March 25th, it was trending on social media platforms worldwide. Trade ministers from Germany, Japan, and South Korea were reportedly sharing it in private communications. The Financial Times called it the most comprehensive indictment of Trump's trade legacy ever published by a foreign government. The Wall Street Journal noted that Canada had essentially weaponized transparency, using detailed documentation to expose the diplomatic and economic costs of America First policies in terms impossible to deny. So how exactly does this infrastructure dependency work, and why is it backfiring so spectacularly right now? Let me break this down in terms that matter. Think of infrastructure construction like building a house. You need foundation materials, structural components, electrical systems, and finishing materials, all delivered in sequence, all meeting specific standards, all available when needed. Now imagine you've spent 8 years insulting your lumber supplier, refusing to pay your electrician, and suing your concrete company. Then you show up asking them to build you a mansion on credit. That's essentially what just happened, but the scale is billions of dollars and affects millions of Americans. Here's the mechanism. Modern infrastructure projects require precise material specifications. A bridge girder isn't generic steel. It's manufactured to specific tensile strength requirements, delivered in exact dimensions, and certified for structural load calculations. According to the American Society of Civil Engineers, 63% of major U.S. infrastructure projects rely on materials that must be sourced internationally because domestic production either doesn't exist at the required scale or can't meet specialized specifications. Canadian manufacturers spent decades building facilities specifically designed to serve American infrastructure needs. They invested in the equipment, trained the workforce, and integrated their production schedules with U.S. construction timelines. When Trump imposed steel tariffs in 2018, he claimed it would revitalize American manufacturing. The data shows something different. U.S. steel production increased by 11% over 6 years. Infrastructure construction costs increased by 47%. According to research from the Yale Budget Lab, American taxpayers paid an additional $63 billion in infrastructure costs between 2018 and 2024, specifically due to tariff-inflated material prices. Meanwhile, Canadian producers simply redirected their output to other markets. China, the European Union, and growing Asian economies were happy to purchase materials America no longer wanted at non-tariff prices. And it gets worse. You can't just restart these supply chains with a phone call. A Canadian steel mill doesn't keep extra capacity sitting idle hoping America will change its mind. Those production lines are now committed to contracts with other countries. The electrical component manufacturers serving U.S. grid projects are now fulfilling orders for infrastructure projects in Southeast Asia. The specialized concrete aggregate operations are supplying European construction firms. Trade analysts call this supply chain reallocation, and it's essentially permanent unless someone is willing to pay premium prices and wait years for capacity to rebuild. The mechanism Trump didn't understand is that tariffs don't just raise prices, they fundamentally destroy relationships and restructure global supply chains. According to economists at the Brookings Institution, every dollar of tariff revenue the administration collected cost the American economy $4 in higher prices, lost contracts, and demolished trading relationships. For infrastructure specifically, the calculation is even worse because construction projects can't wait. When a bridge is declared structurally unsound, you can't wait 3 years for domestic steel production to ramp up. You need materials now, and now those materials aren't available at any price that makes projects financially viable. Let me show you what this looks like on the ground, because these aren't abstract numbers, these are real people watching their futures disappear. Jennifer Martinez, a civil engineer in Detroit, Michigan, spent 4 years developing plans for a $73 million bridge rehabilitation project spanning Interstate 94. The project was supposed to break ground in April 2025, employing 340 construction workers over 18 months. On March 18th, her firm received notice that steel suppliers couldn't meet the delivery schedule at prices within the approved budget. The project is now indefinitely delayed. Jennifer told local reporters that's 340 families who were counting on those jobs. That's 18 months of economic activity for local suppliers and service businesses, and that's a bridge that continues to deteriorate while we wait for materials that aren't coming. Her engineering firm has laid off 17 people. The ripple effects are hitting everyone from the equipment rental companies who had trucks ready to deploy to the local restaurants that were preparing for increased lunch business from construction crews. Or consider Robert Chen, who owns a mid-sized construction company in Pennsylvania that specializes in road infrastructure projects. Robert employs 86 workers directly and contracts with another 150 through subcontractors for specialized work. His company was awarded $6.2 million in contracts for highway expansion work scheduled through 2026. Those contracts required steel and concrete components his suppliers could previously source from Canadian manufacturers at competitive prices. On March 23rd, his primary materials supplier told him prices had increased 47% and delivery timelines had extended from 8 weeks to 6 months minimum. Robert's contracts have fixed price terms. He can't pass these cost increases to state transportation departments. His choice is either absorb losses that would bankrupt his company or walk away from contracts his workers were depending on. He's currently negotiating with banks to extend credit lines, but construction finance experts say firms in his position are facing insolvency rates not seen since the 2008 financial crisis. And it gets worse when you look at communities that were counting on these projects. Take the city of Gary, Indiana, where a $217 million water infrastructure project was supposed to begin construction in May 2025. The project would replace lead pipes, upgrade treatment facilities, and employ 460 workers over 3 years. According to documents from the city's Department of Public Works, the project's financial model assumed material costs based on pre-tariff pricing and Canadian supply availability. On March 21st, the primary contractor submitted a revised bid reflecting current material costs and availability. The new price was $308 million, a 42% increase. The city doesn't have the additional $91 million. Mayor Thomas Richardson told a public meeting on March 26th that this is a community of 68,000 people who've lived with contaminated water for 15 years, waiting for a solution that was finally funded and ready to go. Now we're being told that because of trade policies nobody in Gary asked for or benefited from, our children will continue drinking water from lead pipes for an indefinite period. Multiply these stories by hundreds of similar situations across the country. The American Road and Transportation Builders Association estimates that infrastructure projects worth $173 billion are currently at risk due to material supply disruptions directly traceable to trade policy decisions. That's not a projection. That's projects with funding approved, designs completed, and contracts ready to execute that simply can't proceed because materials aren't available at viable prices. Now let me show you what experts are actually saying about where this leads, because the implications go far beyond delayed projects. According to Dr. Sarah Chen, Director of Trade Policy Research at the Carnegie Endowment, Canada's response represents a fundamental shift in how American allies will deal with future requests for cooperation. She told Bloomberg News that what we're witnessing is the diplomatic equivalent of consequences, where years of transactional deal-making and broken commitments result in trading partners simply deciding cooperation isn't worth the risk. When you treat allies like adversaries and then ask for favors, you shouldn't be surprised when they decline. The Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis published analysis on March 26th, warning that infrastructure delays of this magnitude will reduce GDP growth by approximately 0.3% in 2025 and 2026. That translates to roughly $78 billion in lost economic activity annually. Their research shows infrastructure investment has multiplier effects of approximately 2.5, meaning every dollar of infrastructure spending generates $2.50 of economic activity through employment, materials purchases, and increased productivity from improved roads and bridges. Goldman Sachs infrastructure analysts issued a report March 27th, projecting that if current material supply constraints persist, the United States will need to either substantially increase domestic production capacity, which would require 3 to 5 years and massive capital investment, or repair trading relationships that allow access to established international supply chains. Their modeling suggests that attempting to build sufficient domestic capacity would cost approximately $240 billion in new manufacturing facilities and create material availability by 2030 at the earliest. Meanwhile, infrastructure continues to deteriorate at an accelerating pace. And here's what trade policy experts at the Council on Foreign Relations say really concerns them about the long-term damage. When you destroy trust in international relationships, you don't just lose one deal, you lose the entire framework that made cooperation possible. Canada didn't just reject Trump's request, they documented why cooperation no longer makes strategic sense for them. That document is now circulating among trade ministries worldwide. Other countries are watching what happens when you treat partners badly and then expect them to help when you're desperate. The lesson being learned isn't about specific tariffs or particular materials. The lesson is that America's word can't be trusted, and that has implications for every other international agreement, from climate cooperation to technology standards to military alliances. Let me be crystal clear about what happens next because the timeline matters. In the next 30 to 90 days, you'll see additional infrastructure projects announce delays or cancellations as contractors realize they can't source materials at prices that work. State and local governments that were counting on federal infrastructure funds will have to explain to voters why promised projects aren't happening. Construction workers who were told jobs were coming will instead file for unemployment benefits. Over the next 6 to 12 months, the cascade effects hit harder. Construction firms without work will downsize or close entirely. The equipment manufacturers and material suppliers who depend on construction activity will see orders dry up. Communities with aging infrastructure will face increasing safety concerns as bridges, roads, and water systems continue to deteriorate without scheduled repairs. But here's what really concerns analysts about the permanent damage we're creating. International supply chains that redirect away from American markets don't easily return. When Canadian manufacturers signed long-term contracts with Asian buyers, they committed their production capacity for years. When those relationships prove profitable and reliable, there's no incentive to return to serving American customers who've demonstrated they'll unilaterally impose tariffs whenever politically convenient. According to trade economists at MIT, supply chain reallocation of this magnitude typically takes 8 to 12 years to reverse even under optimal conditions of policy stability and diplomatic repair. We're not in optimal conditions. We're in a situation where America's largest trading partner just published an 18-page explanation of why trusting American commitments is economically irrational. The construction materials shortage is the immediate crisis. The bigger problem is what it represents about America's position in global trade and diplomacy. For 70 years, the United States could rely on allies and trading partners to cooperate because there was mutual benefit and trust in American reliability. Trump's approach treated every relationship as a zero-sum competition where he needed to win and they needed to lose. Canada's response shows what happens when that approach collides with reality. When you actually need something, when you can't do it alone no matter how much you claim otherwise, the countries you've spent years antagonizing will remember. Let's recap the 3 critical points you need to understand about this situation. First, who pays the price for this diplomatic catastrophe? It's not Trump personally, and it's not the wealthy contractors with diversified businesses who can weather delays. It's workers like Jennifer Martinez who spent years planning projects that have evaporated. It's business owners like Robert Chen facing bankruptcy because costs suddenly exceeded their ability to absorb. It's communities like Gary, Indiana, where children will continue drinking contaminated water because the materials needed to fix the problem are no longer available at affordable prices. The human cost of these failed policies is measured in canceled jobs, shuttered businesses, and communities abandoned to infrastructure decay. Second, the scale of what we've destroyed. $173 billion in infrastructure projects at risk. 62% decline in critical construction material imports from Canada. $83 billion in annual trade that used to work seamlessly before tariffs and hostility replaced cooperation. These aren't numbers you fix with a new trade deal or a diplomatic reset. These are supply chains that took decades to build and were demolished in less than a decade of policy chaos. Canadian manufacturers aren't sitting around waiting for America to apologize. They've moved on, found new customers, made new commitments, and learned that depending on the American market means accepting unpredictable political volatility that makes long-term planning impossible. Third, the permanent consequences most people aren't yet seeing. America's infrastructure was already rated D+ by civil engineers before this crisis. Every delayed project means further deterioration. Every bridge that doesn't get repaired becomes less safe. Every water system that doesn't get upgraded creates health risks for more communities. But beyond the immediate infrastructure damage, there's a larger problem about America's place in the world. When allies decide cooperation isn't worth the risk, when trading partners conclude that American commitments aren't reliable, when potential partners look at how we treated Canada and decide they don't want similar treatment, America becomes increasingly isolated. That isolation has economic costs measured in lost opportunities, missed growth, and declining living standards. It has diplomatic costs measured in reduced influence and partners who look to other countries for leadership and reliability. If you found this breakdown valuable, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that subscribe button. I'm working to bring you real analysis of how these policies actually affect real people, not the spin you get from political consultants or the talking points pushed by people with agendas. Your support through subscriptions and likes helps me continue doing this research and bringing you information you need to understand what's actually happening. Here's what keeps me up at night about this situation. We're not just losing infrastructure projects and construction jobs. We're losing something far more valuable. We're losing the trust and cooperation of allies who've stood with America for generations. Canada isn't some distant country we occasionally trade with. They're our neighbor, our largest trading partner, our military ally through NATO and NORAD, and historically one of the most reliable friends America has ever had on the international stage. When that relationship deteriorates to the point where they publish an 18-page document explaining why helping us doesn't make sense anymore, something fundamental has broken. And once that trust is gone, once allies conclude that America's word and commitments aren't worth believing, no amount of money or policy reversals will quickly bring it back. We're watching in real time what happens when short-term political posturing destroys long-term strategic relationships, and the price for that destruction will be paid by American workers, communities, and families for decades to come.